So,
Yes, sir.
what's the one question you wish everybody asked you that nobody did?
Um, I wish someone would ask me if I think narrative is in decline,
Yeah.
because I'd say yes,
Why would you say yes?
because I think it is. No, I don't know. I think we both talked about this a lot lately.
Yeah.
And you know, Aristotle said when a culture's narrative is in decline, that culture is in decline morally.
Is that right?
Yeah, I think he said that, but he said it in Greek. So
So nobody really translates Greek anymore.
no. But I don't know. Like we both teach writing, creative writing, and don't you sometimes even get tired of what you're saying? And
Yes.
you think that can't possibly be true.
Yeah.
And it's like, I don't know, it seems to me that people, readers, not necessarily television, but
Yep.
readers, have now equated story with the chronological aspect of story,
Yep.
which is only a fraction of the actual structure of narrative. I think, anyway. I think narrative is the mode of narrative for storing information and sorting and organizing information. I think it's hardwired, and I think it's evolutionary. And I think the chronological part is almost strictly there as a memory aid. Because the chronological part is all based on causality and agency, right? It sort of tells us what we want to hear, so it sticks. It's like, oh, we have agency in the world, and if I do this, then this happens.
Yeah.
Probably not true. It's scientifically suspect. So, you know, if you look at all the great narratives in history, like going back to the roots in the Greek tradition or the Hebraic tradition, those stories all have all of this layering in them, right?
Yeah.
They have all of this narrative information that is, for lack of a better word, static or not particularly dynamic. And it's all hung kind of fractally. And you can put tons of information in there. And people, like for example, ancient Greeks would know the Iliad and the Odyssey by memory. And they know it because of that chronological structure. But that chronological structure isn't really the meat of a story. So now that's what people want, the chronology.
Yeah.
And I say, because you go to a creative writing course or a workshop or whatever, and everybody's like, find out where the story starts and start it there. And I need to know what the stakes are. Grab me by the first sentence and don't let go.
Yeah.
It starts to sound like a bunch of malnourished parrots chattering at each other in a room they've been locked in for 7 years, which doesn't have proper ventilation. I don't know what that
Well,
means.
what's the meat of the story then? What do you think the heart of it is then?
Well, it depends on the story, right? If you look at what I think are the two roots of Western story, not my idea, comes from a philologist named Auerbach. Those two roots are Hellenic, ancient Greek, mainly Homeric, and Hebraic, which is the stories of the Old Testament. So if you look at the stories of the Old Testament, there's all of this, what Auerbach calls multi-layeredness. So the multi-layeredness could be psychological depths, which are never really explained, and which don't, contra modern story craft, which don't have a clear relationship with the character's actions
Yeah.
and consequences. They're those psychological machinations and those emotional depths have some bearing on what the character does, but it's hard to figure out what they are.
Yeah.
And they're layered deep, and there are, some of the layers contradict other layers. And also the, setting, for example. If you go to the Homeric tradition, and you look at something like the Odyssey, which is this, I looked at a map of the Odyssey once, and it's just like, and they stop everywhere, right? And there are kind of these, excuse me, I just belched, too much tea. Too much beer in the morning. No, there are these miniature stories, but they primarily are focused on setting details or atmospherics or sensuous layering of what we would now think is non-narratival stuff. Often the story will pause. It'll be almost completely static, Well, you soak up those atmospherics and revel in them.
Hmm.
So I get really tired of even telling my own students and my old students what I think is this sort of diminished craft that has come from film originally, and then now it's degenerated and diminished to such an extent that I think most fiction that comes out in book form is actually lower in terms of craft than the film it originally came from.
Hmm.
Like in film, you can still have an establishing shot, right? And it can linger. Yeah. You do that in a book, and someone goes, I don't like that, it takes me out of the story. Start the story. Find out where the story starts and start it there.
Begin at the startling point.
The startling point, yeah. Why would you ever begin at the startling point? I was just reading this book this morning. It's not literary, it's a bestseller from the 50s by Flann O'Brien. And I read about 10 pages and I realized that wouldn't even make it past your first beta reader these days.
No. Well, I think I told you about that fantasy dude that I met.
I like fantasy dudes.
And I was like, so what do you think of Lord of the Rings? He goes, oh, it's way too slow. I never read it. Tried, couldn't.
Right, and Tolkien once said that the only thing he regretted about it wasn't long enough.
Yeah.
That's true. It doesn't really start till like page 70 something, depending on which edition.
Yeah.
But that's some of the best stuff where they just linger in those environments.
So culturally, what do you think that means? Like if you think that story, so you're saying that there's a, I guess what I would say is a leaning out of the richness of story. It's becoming thinner and thinner.
Yeah.
And so what do you mean? What do you think that means culturally?
Diminished attention spans.
Sure.
Greatly diminished. This sounds really elitist, but maybe it is. Greatly diminished ability to process information, especially information that's non-chronological. Information we would traditionally call paradigmatic. Where there's lots of stuff all at once that's interrelated.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I don't think people know how to inhabit our world anymore, except in a really truncated, fast-paced, totally diminished.
Well, here's what I wondered, just on the subject, right? I wondered if writing is just too slow, given the information volumes that we have to deal with.
You could be right.
So, because for example, I noticed in the class that I just offered with Glenn, we would do a lot of video stuff where they would watch a story or an old movie. They loved it. The moment it came to reading, it was like, I don't know. It was like we're asking them to perform a niche kind of thing. that like going back and getting your dentist to do teeth the way they used to before. Here's a shot of whiskey. We're gonna pull your wisdom teeth now, kind of thing.
Or like you asked them to perform some kind of Croatian acrobatics that were popular in the 30s.
Yeah. Yeah, and I just wonder, is it a sign of a revolution or is it a sign of decline? And I haven't been able to see it myself.
It could be both, depending on the context, I guess. You may be right, and that might answer a question I've had for a long time. And that's why people will, at least a certain constituents of people will have the patience to sit through a prestige television show, which has a lot of narrative richness, and it not only has chronology but paradigm, but wouldn't sit through the same story if it was written.
Well, like the Irish one that you were talking about, Irishman.
Yeah, well, people don't even like that. It's too long. But I was thinking of especially the first season of Fargo.
Oh yeah.
I love that. And a lot of people seem to like it, but if it were a book,
it might not work.
Yeah, people will go, well, we don't know what the stakes are for Billy Bob's character. No, he's completely opaque.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of people would say, there are a lot of digressions. They take me out of the story. That one always puzzles me. It takes me out of the story. Well, but you may be right. It may be a simple, it may be evolutionary in that very quickly a lot of people have evolved much faster processing speeds.
Well, text
at
is
the
too
expense.
spare. It's too spare. It's too
Yeah.
lean in it. Like it's a word at a time. And if you've got like all winter in a sod hut on the prairie,
Well, that sounds
awesome,
good.
awesome. Let's go slow as we can, right? But if you're processing so much, because like I think of like this, the paradigm of the vine, right? The 7-second story, this tiny little narrative fragment, or what you were talking about the other day, like a lot of social media, like that. The whole thing is just sort of, it's like almost a balsamic reduction of story where you just take it and you boil it right down to like this
A zip file.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. But the story, if you unzip it, is probably just pretty crude chronology.
Yeah.
Not much more.
Yeah.
Well, the story is usually I'm better than you, or my life is better than you,
Yeah.
and of course it isn't.
Well, that's what I think. I mean, it goes back to that. I think that's one of the interesting things about narrative. I mean, it affirms kind of currently, right? It affirms the idea of you are special,
Yeah, right.
and I think the idea of agency, which I think is a you talk about that evolutionary idea where you have to get out of bed in the morning and feel like you can actually do something. I mean, if you gave up on narrative entirely, I would probably lie in bed and wait for something to happen.
Yep. Plus, you'd get totally overwhelmed with perceptual information.
Yeah.
I think. I mean,
So-
there are other ways to organize it, but going around thinking of your own self as a list,
No.
or most of us don't anyway.
Right. And if you, it would make you unintelligible. If you started to
Yeah.
organize your life another way, I don't know how you could. That would be really interesting to figure out how it could be elsewise organized.
Well, apparently there's a small majority of people who don't really organize their understanding of their self in narrative terms. They call them episodic selves.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Which would be more the Buddhist.
Yeah.
So they'd be more spiritually informed people.
Yeah, they're probably more intelligent and happier than the rest of us.
I don't know. I can tell some pretty awesome narratives about myself, chronologically speaking.
Yeah, but they never satisfy in the end, right? There's
No.
something profoundly unsatisfying about narrative, like the structure, regardless of content, I think. It always, it's never enough in the end, right?
Yeah.
There's always that, well, for me anyway, there's always that strong sense of so much left over that I haven't
It's
attended to.
It's going to be a good interview.
Yeah, am I manspreading?
I hope so.
Yeah.
I got a camera focused right on your crotch, so
Gross.
it's getting bigger. I mean, the
The
camera.
camera.
So here's the second question,
Yeah.
because I don't want to keep you all day, even though it would be.
I'm here all week.
What's the one piece of writing advice you wish you were told before you embarked on this?
Oh.
On your latest book, or anything in there, or even before that.
I wish someone had told me just how many books are actually out there vying for people's attention. I mean, I know there's only one currency on the interwebs, and that's attention. And I know it's primarily an attention economy, but you'll know this as well as anyone. You don't really quite get that until you've put your own product into that attention economy.
Yeah, you watch it almost shrink on the shelf
Oh, it's
in a
just
place like Chapters or something.
Yeah, it's just kind of nauseating. It's like, is there anyone in the world who isn't writing a screenplay or not?
Yeah. Well, and that's an interesting one, because that's where I'm at. I'm like, because I think that's where I'm getting my as we've discussed, the premise fatigue. Because
Yeah.
premise fatigue is really that attention economy kind of coin.
Elevator pitches.
Yeah, and so I wonder what comes after premise fatigue. Or
Substance abuse.
I guess that's
No.
true.
I hear you, and especially when they're framed in a certain way, like if Stephen King and what's another writer? Stephen King and Margaret Atwood had a baby on Mars, who tried to write like Lovecraft. It would sound like that. You know, that kind of
Yeah.
that kind of premising. Like, ugh.
Well, I think that's also a way, that attention economy, a way of people trying to grab known things, because
Yeah.
people are just not willing, basically, like, unless it's like, that's the brilliance of the Big Mac. It's completely predictable. You know exactly what you're going to get, and every single time in this world, right?
That's why Trump likes it,
That's why I love
because
it.
he knows it's clean.
In Japan, in
France,
Scotland, France,
I don't know about
China,
Scotland.
right? It's
Yeah.
the same thing. And what a
Oh, yeah.
lovely thing. And then you create, so someone creates a brand new original story.
Yeah. Who
I mean-
cares, right?
Well, how could it ever find the light of day? Because it
Yeah.
it has to be described in terms that we understand, or we probably won't even consider it.
Yeah. So since there's too much information and far too few filters,
Yeah.
the premise becomes the filter,
Yeah.
de facto filter.
Well said. There you go.
Yeah, but then of course there's like 4,000 exactly identical filters.
Yeah.
I might be exaggerating, but
Well, and then people
Yeah.
stumble into I was so disappointed. Like, now, my story ideas, like, every once in a while I'll go out there and see if, like, an unpublished one will be out there, and I'll be like, almost my identical story's been written.
oh yeah, for sure.
So it's a funny time.
Yeah, I don't know where it's going.
I don't either.
But you may be right that processing speed, as it evolves very quickly, the cognitive abilities. I mean, like any adaptation, it might prove to be both adaptive and maladaptive, depending on the context.
I think you're right. I just think, like, if you look at the amount of information that a person can take in watching a scene of video, as opposed to reading that same scene in text,
Yeah, exactly.
you just ingested so much more
Yeah,
in such a short period of time. Like, it's just a far more efficient data transfer.
yeah, and in many ways, you're right about that. And in many ways, a film like, like one of those two gigantic Avengers films that closed off that chapter in the Marvel universe. It's almost the inverse of what I was talking about earlier, in that the narrative functions as this massive download of visual information.
Yeah.
If you take all that away, there's almost no chronology. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a chronology, but it's about on the level of a Hardy Boys book.
Well, yeah.
That's an old series for those of you who are for boys.
For boys.
Boys. Well, and girls. And non-binary.
No.
It is for everybody. But it was marketed for boys.
'Twas. Look at that. We go like this. Sorry, man.
Hey.
It's me getting to used to all this stuff. It's kind of, but it's cool. I gotta say, I love it. As I've already said, I think
it's
a couple
fun.
times. Here we go. Yeah.
And then also when you think of those Avenger movies, there's a massive... You're taking in a massive amount of kinetic information, right?
Yeah.
The blocking and the dynamic. That is dynamic, but it's not dynamic in the sense... Well, it is dynamic in the sense of causality, in that if I punch you, you punch me back. But it's not the same as the engine of narrative.
No. Well, I think
It's
I've
more
no-
like dance.
I think some of the best things, like I was just watching It's a Wonderful Life again. And I noticed that if you look at the story, it's almost not narrative in
Yes.
parts. It's so episodic.
Yeah.
And I think one of the interesting things about it is it in a sense that the best writing, the best stuff I've ever seen is so episodic, and then the gaps are what the reader fills in,
Mm-hmm.
which is also a rich experience.
Yeah.
So I think in some ways that's where the future of text could go, is far more episodic, far more, just this, here's a thing, here's another thing, and then let the reader kind of connect the dots.
So instead of rising action, it would be risen action. It'd be like giving people a freshly baked loaf of bread,
Yeah.
and they'll eat each slice. And how far can we go with this metaphor?
Oh, very far.
And then you could put butter on one, and then but on the next you could put butter and jelly.
Yeah.
Or honey.
Honey's very good.
But it's all just slices, right?
Yeah.
We should get that going. Risen action. It's pre-rizzed.
Pre-rizzed.
Pre-rose.
Pre-rosen.
This you get a book and it's pre-risen action. You don't have to rise it for yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah, you could be right.
I don't know. It's interesting because I've also been watching other things like car revival videos. So they take a car that's been in a junkyard for 30 years and try and start it.
I like that.
But the thing is, what makes them so interesting and such a thing on the interweb is it's a deep narrative structure.
Yeah.
But they go through these steps,
Yeah.
right? And the steps are almost always the same, you know. But it's very episodic, right?
Yeah.
I've got to file the points. I got to, whatever. Anyway, it's interesting. I'm not sure. Maybe it's the problem is we've become too causal in our own understanding of narrative, and hence wrecked story.
Yeah. Yeah, because you look at the old stories. At the dawn of the variety of written languages, and those characters didn't have a whole lot of agency. I mean, even Odysseus, who's the archetypal cunning man, right? He's not really totally in control of his story. At least not the way modern expectations would want it to be. And the Deus Ex Machinas are vital.
Yeah.
Whereas now they're
huge.
Now they're a craft fault.
Yeah.
Whereas before they sort of signify a different kind of universe. And I think there are still a few genres that trade on that. Noir would be one, horror, and comedy. So there people will still read or watch without the expectation that there's a really airtight causal chain between the interiority of a character, the character's desires, the stakes, the obstacles in front of the characters, the choices, and the escalating action until that one final scene where the balance will be restored or not, or some mix of up or down.
Yeah.
It's funny, you go back through the history of story,
Yeah.
you won't find that anywhere.
No.
It's just this tiny slice of, Anglo-American.
Well, it's like
History.
that story that I wrote that I kept telling you about the organ donor thing.
Oh yeah.
Like, I realized I invited the wrong cast of characters, and even though in my mind's eye I saw this person as the main character, I realized the casting's all wrong to sell the story. It's all wrong. Even though it's right from the core of what I feel is the story's about, it's correct. It's not correct. So you have to shoehorn it all.
That's right.
But
And speaking of shoehorning, there's almost nothing more amusing to me right now is reading textbooks on narrative craft, and there's as we know, there's about 48 million out there, right? Whether it's about screenplays or novels, and then they have their principles or their system or their structure, and then they go back and show how older works demonstrate that structure, and you realize that's not even remotely true. Dickens didn't work like that at all. It's really funny to see them shoehorn, and they have to say things. Well, here are these two principles are actually combined, and this character is an exception.
what a